A 2019 genome study at Seoul National University produced results so unexpected that 3 senior researchers immediately contacted government officials. The data was sealed. Publication was delayed for 18 months. When the findings finally emerged in a heavily redacted journal article, one sentence remained untouched. Korean genetic markers contain sequences that predate every known migration pattern in Asia. This was not a mistake. 5 independent labs verified the results. The Korean genome carries ancestry that science cannot fully explain using current models of human migration. We are not talking about recent history or dynastic bloodlines. We are talking about genetic signatures that challenge fundamental assumptions about where Koreans came from and when they arrived on the peninsula. If you are finding this valuable, hit subscribe. I break down suppressed research and classified findings every week. Now let us talk about what those labs actually found. The standard narrative says Koreans descended from northern Asian populations who migrated south during the late Paleolithic period around 15,000 years ago. Simple story, neat timeline, except the DNA tells a completely different story. Korean genomes contain 3 distinct ancestral components that do not align with this migration model. The first component matches northern Asian populations, which makes sense. The second matches southern coastal groups from what is now Southeast Asia. That is already problematic because it suggests 2 separate founding populations, not 1. But it is the third component that caused the research lockdown. This genetic signature does not match any known population in Asia. It does not match Siberian groups, Mongolian populations, Chinese ethnic groups, or Japanese islanders. When researchers compared it against ancient DNA databases from archaeological sites across Eurasia, they found partial matches in 3 locations: the Caucasus Mountains, the Pontic Steppe near the Black Sea, and surprisingly the Levant region of the ancient Near East. These are not modern connections. The genetic dating puts these markers at 7,000 to 9,000 years old, which means they entered the Korean gene pool during the Neolithic period, thousands of years before any recorded contact between Korea and these western regions. Standard migration models cannot account for this. The geographic distance is too vast. The timeline does not work, and yet the DNA does not lie. Dr. Kim Yunha, one of the lead researchers whose name appeared on the redacted study, gave exactly 1 interview before going silent. She was asked directly whether Koreans could have Western Eurasian ancestry. Her response was carefully worded. She said, "Genetic data suggests contact between Korean populations and groups from Western regions occurred much earlier than historical records indicate, and that the mechanisms of this contact remain under investigation." Then she stopped taking calls. Here is what makes this even stranger. The Korean language is classified as a language isolate, meaning it has no clear relationship to any other language family. Linguists have tried for decades to connect Korean to Altaic languages, Japonic languages, even Proto-Dravidian languages from India. Nothing fits cleanly. The grammar is unique. The phonetic structure is distinct. It is as if Korean developed in complete isolation, which makes no sense for a peninsula connected to the Asian mainland. But if you overlay the linguistic isolation with the genetic anomalies, a pattern emerges. Korean culture, language, and DNA all point to a population that either developed in extreme isolation or originated from a source that current models do not account for. Some researchers have started using the term ghost population to describe the unknown ancestral group that contributed the 3rd genetic component. A ghost population is a group that left genetic traces, but no archaeological or historical record. The Caucasus connection is particularly troubling for mainstream academics. The Caucasus region, located between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, was home to some of the earliest advanced civilizations outside Mesopotamia. The mop culture, which flourished around 5,000 years ago, showed sophisticated metallurgy, complex social structures, and long distance trade networks. Genetic studies of mop remains show they carried unique markers that also appear in ancient Levantine populations. Those same markers appear in modern Koreans, not in Chinese populations, not in Japanese populations, not in Mongolian or Siberian groups, just Koreans. The statistical probability of this being random genetic drift is functionally 0. Something connected these populations, and it happened long before any known historical contact. One hypothesis suggests an ancient maritime route, if coastal populations from the Levant or the Caucasus developed seafaring technology earlier than currently believed. They could have followed coastal routes eastward island, hopping through South Asia, and eventually reaching the Korean peninsula. That scenario could explain the southern coastal Asian component in Korean DNA, the timing, and why no. Land-based archaeological evidence exists because they traveled by sea and left no trail, a point that highlights the sea hypothesis. But this hypothesis has a problem. There is no evidence of advanced seafaring in the Caucasus or Levant during the time frame required. the oldest confirmed ocean-going. Vessels in that region date to around 3,000 years ago, far too recent to account for the genetic data. Either the boats existed and we have not found them, or something else explains the connection. This lack of direct evidence undercuts the maritime hypothesis. The second hypothesis is more controversial. It suggests a northern route through the Eurasian steppe. During the Neolithic period, the steppe was more temperate and supported larger populations than it does today. If a population migrated east from the Caucasus region, moving through Central Asia and eventually reaching the Korean peninsula through Manchuria, they could have introduced Western genetic markers without leaving a clear archaeological trail. Nomadic populations do not build permanent structures. They move constantly. Their material culture is minimal. The problem with this hypothesis is that every modern population along that route, from the Caucasus to Mongolia to northern China, shows diluted versions of these markers, or none at all, but Koreans show concentrated levels. If the markers traveled through these populations, why did they not leave stronger traces along the route? It is as if the ancestral population appeared in Korea, without passing through the intervening regions, which is geographically impossible. The third hypothesis is one that researchers mention carefully and quietly. It suggests that the Korean peninsula itself was the origin point for a population that later migrated west, contributing to Caucasus and Levantine gene pools. This is a reverse migration scenario. This flips the entire model. Instead of Koreans being descendants of Western migrants, Western populations would carry Korean ancestry. The genetic evidence does not rule this out. The dating is ambiguous enough to support either direction of migration. But this creates a massive problem for established archaeological timelines. If Koreans were present on the peninsula 9,000 years ago and had the capability to migrate west and influence Cowes populations, that implies a level of organization, technology, and population size that should have left archaeological evidence. There should be settlements, there should be tools, there should be burial sites, and there are some, but they are sparse and do not match the genetic density the DNA suggests. The Amsa-dong Neolithic site in Seoul provides some answers. Excavations revealed a settlement dating to around 6,000 years ago with pottery styles that have no clear precursor in the region. The pottery appears fully developed with sophisticated techniques that suggest a long period of prior development, but there is no earlier site showing that development. It is as if the technology appeared suddenly. Similar patterns show up at Julman pottery sites across the peninsula. Julman pottery dated to between 8,000 and 3,000 years ago shows design elements that some archaeologists have compared to pottery from the German culture in Japan, and even to pottery from the Black Sea region. The connections are tentative and disputed, but they exist. Now here is where government involvement becomes relevant. In South Korea, genetic research on Korean origins is not just academic, it is political. The Korean government has funded multiple studies aimed at establishing clear genetic continuity between ancient Korean populations and modern Koreans, primarily to counter historical claims made by China and Japan about the origins of Korean civilization. When research produces results that complicate the narrative of indigenous continuity, the situation becomes sensitive. The 2019 study was not classified in the legal sense. It was not labeled top secret or restricted, but publication was delayed, data access was limited, and researchers were strongly encouraged to frame findings in ways that emphasized Korean uniqueness rather than external connections. The term ghost population was preferred over Western ancestry. The possibility of multiple founding populations was downplayed in favor of a model showing admixture occurring after a single Korean population was already established. But the raw genetic data is now partially available through international databases, and independent researchers have started analyzing it. A 2022 paper published by a team at the Max Planck Institute confirmed the presence of Caucasus-related ancestry in Korean genomes and noted that the ancestry is older and more concentrated than in neighboring populations. The paper stopped short of proposing mechanisms, but concluded that current models of Korean ethnogenesis are incomplete. The linguistic evidence supports this. Old Korean reconstructed from ancient texts and place names contains words that have no clear etymology in any known language family. Some of these words relate to metallurgy, agriculture, and governance, suggesting they were borrowed from or influenced by a population with advanced material culture. But there's no record of such a population in the region during the relevant time period. One example is the Korean word for iron chawl. The word does not derive from Chinese, Japanese, or any reconstructed Proto-Oleic root. Some linguists have suggested a possible connection to Proto-Indo-European roots, but the phonetic match is weak and the geographic gap is enormous. It is a word that exists in isolation. Much like the genetic markers, Ke is striking for its isolation. Then there's the matter of mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the maternal line and mutates slowly, making it useful for tracing deep ancestry. Korean mitochondrial DNA shows high frequencies of haplogroups D and M, which are common in East Asia, but it also shows unexpected frequencies of HLO group U, which is typically associated with Western Eurasian populations. Haplogroup U appears in ancient remains from the Caucasus, the Near East, and Europe. In modern Koreans, haplogroup U appears at low but consistent frequencies around 2 to 3%. That is higher than in Chinese or Japanese populations, and significantly higher than would be expected from recent admixture or random mutation. The presence of haplogroup U in Korea, combined with the autosomal DNA markers pointing west, suggests maternal lineages from Western Eurasia entered the Korean gene pool and persisted. Persisted is the key point. The Y-chromosome data is equally puzzling. The most common Y-chromosome HLO group in Korea is O, which is standard for East Asian populations. But Korea also shows elevated frequencies of haplogroup C, particularly subclade C2, which is associated with Northern Asian and some Central Asian populations. More interestingly, small but consistent frequencies of haplogroup R appear in Korean males. HLO group R is predominantly found in Western Eurasia and is the dominant HLO group in Europe and the Near East. Y-chromosome signals add to the puzzle. The combination of Western mitochondrial haplogroups and Western Y-chromosome haplogroups in the same population suggests birectional gene flow, meaning both men and women from Western populations contributed to the Korean gene pool. This was not just a trading contact or a small group of migrants. This was sustained interaction over multiple generations. So what explains it? One possibility is the Silk Road. But the dates don't work. The Silk Road trade networks emerged around 2,000 years ago. Far too recent to account for genetic markers dated to 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Another possibility is the expansion of early Indo-European populations from the steppe. Around 5,000 years ago, populations from the Pontic steppe began migrating in multiple directions, spreading Indo-European languages and genetic markers across Eurasia. But the Korean peninsula is far outside the known range of these migrations. Indo-European markers are strong in Europe, Central Asia, and South Asia, but they thin out dramatically in East Asia. Korea should not have these markers at all, and yet they are there. The distribution does not follow any known migration route. This has led some researchers to propose a pre-Indo-European connection. Before the steppe migrations, the Caucasus region was inhabited by populations that predated the arrival of Indo-European speakers. These populations had their own languages, their own cultures, and their own genetic signatures. If one of these pre-Indo-European groups migrated east during the Neolithic, they could have reached Korea without leaving traces in regions that were later overwritten by Indo-European expansions. This model fits the linguistic data better than the Indo-European model. Korean does not resemble Indo-European languages, but it does share some structural features with ancient Caucasian languages like Haran and Eurasian, both of which are language isolates with no clear connections to other families. The similarities are not strong enough to prove a relationship, but they are present enough to suggest possible contact or shared ancestry. The archaeological record in Korea shows something else unusual. Around 3,000 years ago during the Korean Bronze Age, there's a sudden appearance of advanced metallurgical techniques, particularly in the production of bronze daggers and mirrors. These objects show designs and production methods that have parallels in the Karasuk culture of southern Siberia and the Seima-Turbino metallurgical tradition of the Eurasian steppe. The Seima-Turbino phenomenon is one of the strangest events in prehistoric archaeology. Around 4,000 years ago, highly advanced bronze working techniques appeared simultaneously across a vast area stretching from the Urals to Mongolia. The techniques were so advanced and so uniform that they suggest either rapid diffusion from a single source or the migration of specialized craftspeople. Korean bronze work from the same period shows enough similarity to suggest contact with this network. But here's the issue. The same Turbino network is associated with Western Eurasian populations, and Korean bronzes appear at the eastern extreme of this network's range. If Koreans were in contact with these populations, it implies trade routes, cultural exchange, and possibly population movement on a scale that leaves no other clear evidence. The pottery evidence adds another layer. Mumen pottery, which appeared in Korea around 3,000 years ago, shows firing techniques and clay composition that some researchers have compared to pottery from the Andronovo culture of the Central Asian steppe. The Andronovo culture is linked to early Indo-Iranian populations and is far removed geographically from Korea. The connection is disputed, but the technical similarities are real. So we have genetic data pointing west, linguistic anomalies pointing west, metallurgical traditions pointing west, pottery techniques pointing west. All of it dating to periods long before recorded history, and all of it involving Korea specifically, not neighboring regions. One researcher I spoke with off the record described it as a convergence of evidence that nobody wants to address directly because it breaks too many models. The East Asian origin model does not account for Western markers. The Western migration model does not account for the lack of intermediate populations. The indigenous development model does not account for the sudden appearance of advanced technologies. Every model has gaps. The classified aspect of the research is not about secrecy in the traditional sense. It is about control over narrative. Genetic research has political implications in East Asia. China has used genetic studies to argue for historical claims over Korean territory. Japan has used genetic studies to argue for shared ancestry that complicates Korean historical narratives. When Korean researchers produce data that suggests external origins or mixed ancestry, it can be weaponized politically. That is why the 2019 study was delayed, not because the data was wrong, but because the implications were inconvenient. Koreans prefer a narrative of long indigenous continuity on the peninsula and genetic data suggesting multiple founding populations from diverse geographic origins undermines that narrative. But the data exists, and it is not going away. The technical details of the genetic analysis reveal just how precise these findings are. Researchers used whole genome sequencing on more than 500 Korean individuals, comparing their DNA against reference databases that include genetic information from more than 3,000 ancient samples and 50,000 modern individuals worldwide. The analysis examines single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny variations in DNA that accumulate over time, and can be used to trace ancestry with remarkable precision. What emerged was a genetic profile that showed Koreans clustering separately from all other East Asian populations. When analyzed using principal component analysis, Chinese populations formed one cluster, Japanese populations formed another, and Mongolian and Siberian groups formed a third. Koreans occupied a distinct position on the plot, pulled slightly toward Western Eurasian populations in a way no other East Asian group showed. The statistical significance was impossible to dismiss. The p-values, which measure the probability that results occurred by chance, were well below the threshold of scientific significance. This was not noise in the data, and it was not contamination. This was a real genetic signal that persisted for thousands of years despite waves of migration and mixture that should have diluted it. Researchers then performed admixture modeling, which estimates the percentage of ancestry from different source populations. The results showed that modern Koreans derive approximately 60 to 65% of their ancestry from northern East Asian populations, 20 to 25% from southern coastal Asian populations, and 10 to 15% from an unknown source that showed strongest affinity to ancient Caucasus populations. That 10 to 15% is the ghost population component. To put that in perspective, 10 to 15% ancestry from a geographically distant population is substantial. It is not a trace amount that could be explained by a recent admixture or a few individuals. It suggests that roughly 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 of the founding individuals who contributed to modern Korean ancestry came from this Western source. That is a significant founding population that left no historical record. The research team attempted to date when this admixture occurred using genetic clocks, which estimate time based on the length of DNA segments inherited from each ancestral population. Longer segments suggest recent admixture and shorter segments suggest ancient admixture because recombination breaks up DNA segments over generations. The Korean data showed very short segments indicating the admixture occurred at least 200 to 300 generations ago, which translates to roughly 6,000 to 9,000 years before present. This timing places the admixture firmly in the Neolithic period during the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural societies. This was a time of massive population movements across Eurasia. The spread of agriculture from the Fertile Crescent into Europe is well documented, and the spread of millet farming from northern China into Korea is also documented. But a connection between the Caucasus region and Korea during this period is completely unexpected. One possibility researchers explored is the spread of agricultural technology itself. If farming techniques spread along with the people who practiced them, the movement of agricultural knowledge from west to east could have carried genetic markers along the same routes. There is evidence that millet cultivation, which became dominant in Korea, originated in northern China around 9,000 years ago. Some researchers have suggested that millet farming itself may have been influenced by earlier wheat and barley cultivation techniques from Western Asia. The archaeological evidence for this is thin but intriguing. At Julman period sites in Korea dating to around 6,000 years ago, researchers have found carbonized grain remains that were initially identified as millet, but showed morphological features inconsistent with the wild millet varieties native to East Asia. Some archaeobotanists have suggested these could be hybrid varieties or could indicate contact with agricultural populations from outside the region. There is also the matter of domesticated animals. Ancient DNA from dog remains found at Korean Neolithic sites shows genetic lineages that trace back to both East Asian wolf populations and, surprisingly, to dog populations from Central Asia and the Near East. Dogs were among the first animals domesticated by humans, and they traveled with human populations during migrations. The presence of Western dog lineages in ancient Korea suggests that people, not just trade goods, made the journey. The pottery evidence becomes more compelling when examined in detail. Jewelman pottery from Korea shows a technique called paddle and anvil construction, where clay is shaped by striking it with a paddle against an anvil. This technique appears in pottery from the Black Sea region during roughly the same time period. It also appears in German pottery from Japan, suggesting either independent invention or transmission along coastal routes. But it is the decorative motifs that are most striking. Some Jewelman pottery shows geometric patterns, particularly zigzag and herringbone designs that are nearly identical to patterns found on pottery from the Dnepr-Donetsk culture of the Pontic steppe, dated to around 7,000 years ago. These are not simple universal patterns like circles or lines. These are complex repeated motifs that require cultural transmission to appear in such similar forms across such vast distances. Linguistic analysis provides additional circumstantial support. Korean has a unique grammatical feature called hierarchical kinship terminology, where different words are used for older versus younger siblings and for maternal versus paternal relatives. This feature is rare globally, but appears in some Caucasian languages and in Proto-Indo-European reconstructions. It is not proof of connection, but it is another data point in a growing pile of coincidences. The Korean counting system also shows anomalies. Korean has two number systems, one native Korean and one borrowed from Chinese. The native Korean numbers from 1 to 10 show no clear relationship to any neighboring language family. Some linguists have noted distant phonetic similarities to numbers in Proto-Kartalian languages from the Caucasus, but the connections are speculative and hotly disputed. What is not disputed is that something unusual happened in Korean prehistory. The convergence of genetic, archaeological, and linguistic evidence points to contacts or movements that current models do not predict. Whether that contact was a single migration event, multiple smaller movements, or sustained trade and cultural exchange over millennia remains an open question. What the data actually shows is that Koreans are one of the most genetically unique populations in East Asia. The mixture of Northern Asian, Southern Coastal, and Western Eurasian components is not found in this combination anywhere else. That uniqueness is the result of Korea's geographic position at the crossroads of multiple ancient migration routes and its relative isolation during certain historical periods. The Korean peninsula acted as a terminus for migrations moving east and a refuge for populations displaced by later migrations. Over thousands of years, these groups mixed, creating a population that carries genetic echoes of movements that reshaped Eurasia during the Neolithic and Bronze Age. The Western markers are not evidence of recent contact. They are evidence of ancient connections that predate the formation of modern ethnic identities. The future of this research depends on access. As more ancient DNA is recovered from archaeological sites across Eurasia, the gaps will fill in. We will find the intermediate populations. We will map the migration routes. We will understand the mechanisms. But right now, we are working with incomplete data, and the gaps are where the controversy lives. What is clear is that the story of Korean origins is more complex than any single narrative allows. Koreans are not simply descendants of northern migrants. They are not simply an indigenous population that developed in isolation. They are the product of multiple ancient migrations, contacts, and mixtures that science is only beginning to unravel. The classified research will eventually be declassified. The data will become public, and when it does, expect the historical narratives to shift. Because the DNA is telling a story that historians have not written yet, and that story involves connections across vast distances during time periods we thought were defined by isolation. That is where we are now. Genetic data that points to ancient connections nobody can fully explain. A population that carries markers from regions thousands of miles away. And a research community that is trying to build models that account for all of it without breaking established frameworks. Subscribe if you want to see where this goes. I will be covering every update as the data comes out.